Ever wondered why you work 9 to 5? Why your school, your city, your language, even your moral compass is shaped the way it is? The answer might surprise you. Because whether you realize it or not, you are still living in the shadow of the Victorian era. This was the age that gave us electricity, factories, global empires, and also child labor, slums, and the obsession with being proper. It built the modern world brick by brick, and today, we're still walking through its blueprint. So buckle up. We're about to dive into the entire history of the Victorian era, not just what happened, but how it shaped your life today. The dawn of the Victorian Age, a changing world, 1837 to 1850. Before smartphones, skyscrapers, or even electricity in every home, there was the Victorian era. And whether you know it or not, this era shaped the way you live today. Let's rewind to the very beginning. The year is 1837. Britain is tense. The King, William IV, has died. And in his place, an 18-year-old girl, shy and barely prepared, takes the throne. Her name? Alexandrina Victoria. But history would know her simply as Queen Victoria. She wasn't expected to be queen. Her uncles had no legitimate heirs. And suddenly, this teenage girl, who'd never even been alone with a man outside her family, becomes the most powerful woman in the world. Cut to painting of young Victoria at her coronation. She stood barely 5 feet tall, but would rule an empire that covered a quarter of the Earth's population. But what kind of world was she stepping into? Britain before Victoria, a country on the edge. Britain in the early 1800s was a nation divided. On the one hand, you had the growing middle class, fueled by the Industrial Revolution. On the other, deep poverty, overcrowded slums, and terrible working conditions. The Industrial Revolution had already been roaring for decades. Machines were replacing human hands in factories. Railroads were being laid down like veins across the country. Coal powered it all, and black smoke filled the skies of cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and of course, London. But while the rich got richer, the poor were barely surviving. Children as young as 5 were working in coal mines. Women worked 16-hour shifts in textile mills. If you got injured, you were likely fired. If you got sick, there was no help. And if you protested, you risked prison or worse. Insert newspaper visuals and etchings of child labor and poorhouses. That's the Britain young Victoria inherited. One full of contradictions, innovation and suffering, wealth and desperation. The role of the monarch, figurehead or force. Now, let's make something clear. Queen Victoria wasn't ruling like a medieval monarch. The monarchy was constitutional, meaning Parliament held the real power, especially the Prime Minister. But that doesn't mean Victoria was just a decoration. She wrote thousands of letters, met with every Prime Minister weekly, and gave her opinions on major policies. She wasn't a ruler like Henry VIII, but she knew how to influence people. And she had one major ally early on, Lord Melbourne, her first Prime Minister. Melbourne, a seasoned politician, became a mentor to the young queen. Some even whispered that he was more like a father, or even crush. But their bond was political and personal, and he taught her how to handle court life, parliament, and the brutal press. The rise of the middle class and moral reform. One thing that defined the Victorian era was middle-class morality, hard work, thrift, discipline, and respectability. In these early years, the idea of the respectable family was everything. Men were expected to work hard, women to be modest and domestic, children to be well-behaved. Narrator, tone shifts slightly. But here's the irony. These values were being pushed hardest by the same class of people who had benefited most from industrial capitalism, while ignoring the harsh reality for millions living in poverty. Still, there were reforms. Slowly, Britain was waking up. In 1834, the Poor Law was introduced. It tried to make workhouses so unpleasant that people would avoid relying on them. Child labor laws were debated. Some were passed. But enforcement? That was another matter. Campaigns began to push for education for all, though it would take decades to become real. Queen Victoria's marriage, love and symbolism. In 1840, Queen Victoria married her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. And this wasn't a cold political alliance, it was genuine love. Insert visuals of their wedding, black and white drawings, and Albert's portrait. Albert was serious, intelligent, and moral. He brought with him ideas from Germany about science, arts, and reform. And together, Victoria and Albert created the image of the perfect royal couple, devoted, clean living, and family-centered. Their influence was immense. They popularized Christmas trees in Britain. Albert championed art and science, laying the groundwork for what would become the Great Exhibition of 1851, a celebration of industry and empire, global power and hidden exploitation. Now let's zoom out. By the 1840s, Britain had become the most powerful nation on earth. Its navy ruled the seas. Its colonies stretched across the globe: India, Canada, parts of Africa, the Caribbean. British goods and British soldiers were everywhere. But here's the darker side. Much of that wealth came from exploitation. The East India Company wasn't just trading tea, it was ruling India. British businessmen profited from sugar plantations in the Caribbean, which had only recently stopped using enslaved labor. And in China, Britain would fight the Opium Wars to force the Chinese to accept opium grown in India. This wasn't just empire, it was economic domination, crises and revolutions in Europe. Back in Europe, the late 1840s brought a wave of revolutions. In 1848, uprisings broke out in France, Germany, Austria, and Italy. Kings were overthrown. New governments were declared. The very idea of monarchy seemed to be dying, but not in Britain. Why? Partly because reforms had already begun. Britain wasn't perfect, far from it, but it had a parliament, a growing press, and space for public debate. And Victoria, now a wife and mother, was popular. The people saw her not as a tyrant, but as a symbol of stability. The Irish famine, a tragedy of the empire. But not everyone under British rule was treated equally. In Ireland, from 1845 to 1852, a potato blight caused mass starvation. Ireland, part of the United Kingdom at the time, was heavily dependent on the potato. When crops failed, millions went hungry. 1 million people died. Another million emigrated. The British government's response? Too little, too late. They sent some aid, but refused to halt exports of other Irish crops. For many, this wasn't just a tragedy. It was seen as a crime of neglect. It left deep scars in Irish history and resentment toward the British Crown. But while Queen Victoria stood as a symbol of order and family values, the world around her was speeding up. Faster trains, longer factory hours, more newspapers, more voices. Everything was accelerating. By the 1850s, Britain was booming. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just reshaping cities. It was reshaping people's daily lives. The rise of the railways and a shrinking island. If you had lived in Britain in 1830, traveling from London to Manchester would have taken you 4 days by horse. By 1850, that journey took 4 hours by train. Railways changed everything. They weren't just transportation, they were transformation. Fresh milk could now be delivered to cities. Newspapers printed in London reached Scotland by morning. Middle-class families could take weekend holidays to the seaside. A new idea entirely. The countryside shrank and cities expanded. The Victorian era became an age of mobility, not just in distance, but in class. Suddenly, with the right job or business idea, a poor man could become middle class, at least in theory. But not everyone could climb that ladder. For the urban poor, life was still brutal. Urban life, slums, smoke, and struggle. Let's be clear, Victorian cities were not glamorous. Most poor families lived in tenement housing, crammed into 1 or 2 rooms with no plumbing, no ventilation, and no privacy. Diseases like cholera, tuberculosis, and typhoid spread rapidly. One of the biggest killers? Dirty drinking water. In London alone, raw sewage flowed directly into the Thames, the same river people used for drinking and cooking. In 1858, the stench got so bad it became known as the Great Stink. Parliament, which sat near the river, nearly shut down from the smell. But finally, this forced change. Engineers like Joseph Bazalgette began building modern sewers. the beginning of real urban sanitation. It was one of the greatest public health reforms of the century. The Great Exhibition of 1851, a nation shows off. But not all news was grim. In 1851, Prince Albert organized one of the most ambitious displays the world had ever seen, the Great Exhibition, held in London's newly constructed Crystal Palace, a massive building made entirely of iron and glass. Over 6 million visitors came to see inventions from all over the world. British steam engines, Indian textiles, French perfumes, American reapers, African art. The message was clear. Britain rules the world. And here's the proof. It wasn't just a fair. It was propaganda, celebrating empire, industry, and modernity. And it worked. Victoria and Albert were praised, and the middle class felt proud to be part of this booming nation. But under that glass roof, something else was on display. A world order built on hierarchy, race, and domination. Women in the Victorian age. Angels or prisoners. Now let's talk about gender. The Victorian ideal woman was an angel in the house. Pure, gentle, obedient. Her role was to raise children, support her husband, and maintain the home. But this ideal was only possible for wealthy or middle-class women. Working-class women were in factories, laundries, and kitchens, often doing more labor than their husbands. Legally, women had almost no rights. A married woman couldn't own property, couldn't vote, and had limited access to education or professions. But cracks were starting to form. Writers like Mary Wollstonecraft, decades earlier, had already planted seeds of feminism. In the Victorian era, more women began publishing novels, founding schools, and demanding reform. Women like Florence Nightingale transformed nursing from a low-status job into a profession. Others, like Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, fought to become doctors and won. It was a slow revolution, but it had begun. Science, religion, and the age of doubt. By the 1850s and 60s, new scientific discoveries were challenging old beliefs. The biggest shock came in 1859, when Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. His theory of evolution clashed with the biblical idea that humans were created instantly by God. Victorian society, so proud of its morals and order, was rocked by doubt. Were humans really descended from apes? Could nature be cruel, random, and godless? This sparked debates across universities, churches, and dinner tables. Some embraced science. Others clung tighter to faith. Many tried to find a middle ground. Victorian thinkers were obsessed with finding order in biology, in society, in morality. But suddenly, the world seemed more chaotic and mysterious than ever before. Empire and control. The sun never sets. While Britain argued over faith and progress, its empire kept growing. The Victorians liked to say, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And it was true from Australia to Canada, India to Africa. British flags flew everywhere. But what did empire mean? For the British elite, it meant wealth, adventure, and power. For those colonized, it often meant extraction, violence, and suppression. Nowhere was this clearer than in India. In 1857, Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, rebelled against the British East India Company. The causes were deep cultural disrespect, economic exploitation, and brutal treatment. The British crushed the rebellion brutally. Thousands were killed. Villages were burned. Afterward, the East India Company was dissolved, and India came under direct rule of the British Crown. Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India in 1876, symbolizing both her power and the sheer reach of her empire. The cost of progress, inequality at home and abroad. And yet, while the empire expanded, inequalities at home persisted. In the countryside, landowners thrived, while farmers were forced to move to cities or emigrate. In Scotland, the Highland clearances pushed thousands from their ancestral homes. In Wales and the North, coal miners toiled underground for meager wages. In the colonies, people were taxed, controlled, and civilized, often against their will. Victorian progress came at a price, and not everyone paid it equally. The making of the modern world. Still, the Victorian age pushed Britain into modernity. By the 1860s, the telegraph had shrunk the world. Messages that once took weeks now arrived in minutes. Factories produced goods at dizzying speed. Banks and stock markets connected capital across continents. The middle class had power now, real power. They could vote, build businesses, publish newspapers, shape politics. And while Queen Victoria remained a symbol of tradition, the country she ruled had become a laboratory of the future. Urban, industrial, global, conflicted. As Britain marched through the second half of the 19th century, its confidence was sky high. The empire was expanding, industry was booming, and Queen Victoria was becoming a living symbol of British power. But behind this polished surface, deeper social, political, and psychological tensions were building. The Queen herself had changed. In 1861, tragedy struck. Prince Albert died suddenly of typhoid fever. He was just 42 years old. Victoria was devastated. He had been her closest advisor, her emotional anchor, and her partner in everything. She withdrew from public life almost entirely, wearing black for the rest of her life, rarely appearing at public events, and earning the nickname the Widow of Windsor. Her absence sparked public criticism. Some questioned whether she was still fit to rule. Others accused her of abandoning the nation. But Victoria refused to step back into the spotlight. Grief, for her, became a way of life and a symbol of duty in mourning. The working class awakens, the fight for rights. While the Queen mourned in private, change surged in public. The working class, factory workers, miners, dockhands, weavers, had begun to organize. For decades, they had been voiceless, underpaid, and overworked. But now, they demanded recognition. Unions were forming. Newspapers were speaking directly to laborers. And above all, there was one central demand: the vote. The political system was still controlled by the wealthy. The Reform Act of 1832 had only expanded voting to the middle classes, not the poor. But pressure was building for more. By the 1860s, protests and petitions pushed Parliament to act. And in 1867, the Second Reform Act was passed. It doubled the number of men who could vote, now including many working-class men in cities. This was a breakthrough. It signaled that the government could no longer ignore the urban masses. Democracy, though still limited, was growing. And the idea of representation was taking root far beyond the elite drawing rooms of Westminster. The empire's hidden hands, Africa and beyond. As politics changed at home, imperial ambitions continued abroad. Britain's attention now turned increasingly toward Africa, rich in resources and seen as a continent ripe for civilizing. Africa became the next frontier in the imperial race. British explorers like David Livingstone ventured deep into the heart of the continent, preaching Christianity, documenting landscapes, and reporting back tales that captivated Victorian readers. But exploration soon turned into exploitation. In Egypt, Britain gained control of the Suez Canal, a key route to India, and soon occupied the country. In South Africa, tensions with Dutch settlers, the Boers, and local African tribes laid the groundwork for future wars. Back in London, these imperial ventures were sold to the public as moral missions, bringing progress, order, and civilization. But on the ground, they often involved military conquest, economic control, and racial hierarchy. The Victorian Empire was expanding not just through trade, but through force, science, and spectacle, the age of discovery and display. Victorian Britain was fascinated by science and by the idea of cataloging the world. It was the age of the museum, the zoo, and the exhibition. New fossils were being uncovered, challenging ideas about Earth's age. Chemists discovered new elements. Engineers built bridges and steamships that defied nature. The telegraph, telephone, and eventually the electric light redefined communication and time itself. But with this obsession came something darker: scientific racism. Some Victorian scientists used biology to argue that white Europeans were more advanced than other races, giving imperialism a dangerous new justification. People from colonized lands were even displayed at public shows, like human exhibits, a shocking practice that revealed the deep contradictions of an empire claiming to be enlightened. while dehumanizing millions. Still, many Victorians saw science as hopeful, a tool that could improve health, extend life, and unlock the universe. The belief in progress, especially technological, was almost religious. The changing face of cities, technology and transformation. Cities, once choked with soot and disease, began to improve slowly. Gas lights lit up streets at night. Electric trams started replacing horses. Parks were built. Public libraries opened. Schools multiplied. A growing sense emerged that cities should not just serve industry, but also people. The Public Health Acts of the 1870s and 1880s enforced cleaner streets, fresh water systems, and garbage removal. This wasn't out of pure compassion. Outbreaks like cholera had shown the elite that disease didn't care about class boundaries. Architecture, too, began to define the Victorian world. Gothic revival buildings, massive railway stations, red brick factories, and grand civic halls. London, in particular, became a global capital, part medieval, part modern. But alongside this grandeur remained harsh reality. Street children, sweatshops, slums. The rise of the new woman and cultural shifts. By the 1880s, women were increasingly questioning their role in society. Educated women were pushing boundaries. They wanted more than just the domestic sphere. The new woman, independent, educated, politically conscious, became a powerful cultural figure. She appeared in novels, essays, and real life, sometimes riding a bicycle, reading newspapers, even attending university. This horrified traditionalists but thrilled reformers. Victorian literature reflected this shift. Writers like Thomas Hardy, George Eliot, and Oscar Wilde explored themes of gender, morality, repression, and class. The theater, long considered morally questionable, was revived as a space for challenging ideas. And through it all, the English language was codified, spread, and formalized, turning English into the language of empire, trade, and global influence. An empire of contradictions. It's easy to romanticize the Victorian era, the elegance, the inventions, the image of a proud empire under a long-reigning queen. But the truth is more complicated. This was a world of stunning innovation and crushing poverty, of grand ideas and grim realities, a time when human rights and imperial conquest existed side by side, when science soared and superstition still held sway, when moral virtue was praised, but vice was hidden behind closed doors. Victorian society was obsessed with appearances, proper dress, polite manners, respectable behavior. But beneath the corsets and the top hats lay fear, repression, and a deep anxiety about change. Britain in a new light. By the final decades of the 19th century, Britain was not the same country Victoria had inherited in 1837. It was wealthier, more powerful, more urban, more educated, but also more divided, more restless, and more questioned from inside and out. And while Queen Victoria still sat on the throne, she was now a widowed matriarch ruling over a society that had outgrown many of the ideals she had once stood for. She remained loved by many, respected by most, but the age she had once defined was beginning to shift beneath her feet. As the Victorian century drew closer to its end, Britain stood at a crossroads. The empire was vast, wealthier, and more global than ever before, but the foundation beneath that wealth was beginning to tremble. Technological power had soared, but so had inequality. Cities had grown brighter, but the shadows within them had grown deeper. And with each passing year, the illusion of certainty that had once defined the Victorian mindset began to unravel. Political reform and the people's voice. One of the biggest changes in late Victorian Britain was political. After the Second Reform Act of 1867, which gave voting rights to many urban working-class men, the movement for democracy only grew louder. More reforms followed. In 1884, the Third Reform Act expanded the vote to most rural working-class men as well. This shift fundamentally changed British politics. For the first time, politicians had to listen to the poor or risk losing power. Political parties evolved too. The old divide between the Tories, Conservatives, and Whigs, Liberals, was no longer enough. A new voice began to emerge, a movement that spoke directly for the laboring classes. In 1893, the Independent Labour Party was formed. It was small at first, but it marked the beginning of something revolutionary. Working people demanding not just wages, but political power. This was more than politics. It was a crack in the old social order, a warning that the Victorian ideal, with its strict classes and fixed roles, would not last forever. The Irish question and nationalism at home. Not all unrest came from the cities. Across the Irish Sea, tensions had been building for decades. Ireland was still ruled by Britain, but most Irish people were Catholic, poor, and increasingly angry about land ownership, famine legacy, and the lack of political autonomy. In the late 1800s, movements for Irish Home Rule gained strength. Leaders like Charles Stewart Parnell pushed for Ireland to have its own parliament and self-governance. The debate divided Britain. Some feared it would shatter the empire. Others saw it as a long overdue act of justice. Violence also played a part. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, later known as the Fenians, carried out bombings and assassinations. In return, British authorities cracked down harshly, fueling more resentment. At home, nationalism was growing, and abroad, it was growing even faster. The empire tightens its grip and meets resistance. By the 1880s and 90s, the British Empire was at its peak in size, controlling territories on every continent except Antarctica. In Africa, Britain was involved in fierce scrambles for land with France, Germany, and Belgium. The Berlin Conference of 1884 had carved up the continent between European powers without a single African voice at the table. In southern Africa, the British clashed with the Dutch-descended Boers, and by 1899, war erupted, the brutal and bloody Second Boer War. It was a shocking campaign. The British used scorched earth tactics, destroyed farms, and placed civilians, including women and children, in concentration camps. Over 26,000 Boer civilians died in those camps. At home, the public was divided. Some supported the war proudly. Others, especially liberals and religious groups, were horrified. This war revealed a hard truth. Maintaining an empire required violence, and people were beginning to notice the crisis of confidence, anxiety beneath progress. Despite all the growth, many Victorians, especially in the 1890s, began to feel unease. There was a sense that the empire was too big, the cities too crowded, the social changes too fast. Writers, artists, and philosophers began to question the very values that had defined the century. Oscar Wilde mocked Victorian morality and exposed its hypocrisies through biting wit and scandal. Thomas Hardy portrayed rural decline and emotional repression in his novels. The aesthetic movement rejected utility and moral art, declaring instead, art for art's sake. And then came Jack the Ripper. In 1888, the brutal unsolved murders of women in London's East End shattered the image of a safe, ordered society. Newspapers covered every detail obsessively. The killer was never found. But the message was clear. Even in the heart of the empire, darkness reigned. The Victorian confidence in reason, order, and moral superiority began to crack. The changing role of women, from silence to struggle. The women's movement intensified in the 1890s. Victorian women had long been taught to be quiet, modest, and dependent. But more and more, they were organizing, educating, and demanding equal rights. Groups like the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies pushed for women's right to vote through peaceful protest and petitions. Later, more radical groups like the Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, would use direct action, disrupting Parliament, chaining themselves to railings, even going to prison. Although full suffrage for women wouldn't come until the 20th century, the fight was underway, and many Victorians, especially men in power, were deeply alarmed. To them, a woman voting was an attack on the natural order. But to the women themselves, it was simple. They were no longer content to be second-class citizens. Science, psychology, and the mind turned inward. As the 19th century neared its end, science continued to advance, but its focus began to shift. Victorian science had once looked outward, mapping the stars, cataloging species, building machines. But now it started looking inward. into the mind, the emotions, the subconscious. This was the era of Sigmund Freud, whose early work challenged the idea that people were purely rational beings. He argued that we are driven by hidden desires, fears, and trauma, ideas that shocked Victorian sensibilities. The field of psychology was born just as religious certainty was fading. People were no longer sure that progress meant goodness, or that invention meant virtue. This internal shift mirrored the political one. Victorians were beginning to ask, who are we really? And what lies beneath our polished surface? The Queen's final years, the symbol of an era. Through all of this change, Queen Victoria remained, aging, mourning, and watching a world transform. She had become a national grandmother figure, revered, respected, but distant. Her reign had lasted longer than any monarch before her. She had seen steam engines and electric lights, revolutions and reforms, tragedy and triumph. By her final decade, she had outlived most of her prime ministers, many of her children, and nearly all the social values that had once defined her reign. She rarely appeared in public, but when she did, crowds still cheered. To the people of Britain and to the empire at large, she was more than a person. She was an idea. And as that idea prepared to pass from history into memory, the world was already stirring with the first winds of a new century, one that would challenge everything the Victorians thought they knew. On January 22, 1901, Queen Victoria died at the age of 81 at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. She had reigned for more than 63 years, longer than any monarch in British history at that time. Her funeral marked more than just the end of a life. It marked the end of an age. Across Britain and the Empire, millions mourned. Trains stopped. Newspapers printed in black. Soldiers stood silent in colonies thousands of miles away. And yet, behind all the ceremony and sorrow, a quiet uncertainty began to rise. Because what came next was not just a change of monarch. It was a shift into an entirely new world. The Victorian legacy. What did it all mean? By the time of Victoria's death, the world she was born into no longer existed. When she took the throne in 1837, people lit their homes with candles, traveled by horse, had no phones, no indoor toilets, no rights if they were women or poor. Now in 1901, Britain had electricity, automobiles, telephones, cinemas, and a complex class structure in flux. Science had turned nature into code. Industry had turned coal into global power. And the British Empire ruled over nearly 25% of the world's population. But there was a paradox. Despite all the innovation and expansion, the society Victoria left behind was also one of profound anxiety. The progress was real, but so was the pain. The achievements were staggering, but so were the contradictions. Many were beginning to wonder, had the costs of this progress been too high? The rise of the Edwardian age and growing shadows. With Queen Victoria gone, the throne passed to her son, Edward VII. The Edwardian era, though technically outside the Victorian age, felt like a long, slow exhale after decades of restraint. Social norms loosened. Art became more sensual. Fashion more flamboyant. The ruling class, now confident and global, indulged in luxury and display. But that luxury floated above growing tension. Behind the grand country houses and glittering balls, Britain faced deeper, more urgent questions. Would the empire last? Could the working class be kept content? Would women ever gain full rights? And what would science, now outpacing morality, unleash next? The seeds sown during the Victorian period, industrial growth, imperial expansion, class awakening, gender struggle, had begun to grow wild, outside the control of the very people who had planted them. Technology speeds up, society tries to catch up. The inventions of the late 1800s began changing society faster than ever before. The motor car, once a novelty, began rolling across cobblestone streets. The typewriter sped up office work. The gramophone brought music into middle-class homes. Photography, once rare, became a way to preserve everyday memories. And just on the horizon, flight. In 1903, the Wright brothers would make their first successful flight in America. And though it wasn't British, the world took note. Humanity was no longer earthbound. The Victorian dream of conquering nature was becoming real and terrifying. Yet, as machines grew stronger and more lifelike, the people building and operating them still fought for dignity. Industrial labor remained punishing. Workers organized strikes, unions, and protests. The idea that progress must include justice was no longer radical. It was becoming essential. Education, childhood, and the new citizen. One of the quieter revolutions of the Victorian age had been the transformation of childhood. In early 19th century Britain, children were workers. In factories, mines, chimneys, and fields. Many didn't survive beyond their 5th birthday. But by the end of Victoria's reign, a different image had emerged. The child as a student, a citizen in training, a future adult. New laws required schooling. Child labor was restricted. Public concerns shifted from discipline to development. Books like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Peter Pan reflected this shift. Children weren't just mini adults. They had inner worlds, imaginations, and rights of their own. Education also began to shape identity. The British state wanted citizens who were loyal, moral, and efficient. Schools taught not only reading and arithmetic, but also nationalism, manners, gender roles, and obedience. The empire wasn't just built with armies, it was built in classrooms. Faith, doubt, and the moral struggle. Throughout the Victorian era, religion had played a central role, shaping laws, customs, and daily life. But by the end of the 19th century, faith no longer held unquestioned authority. Science had chipped away at traditional beliefs. Evolution challenged creation. Psychology challenged the soul. Archaeology raised questions about biblical timelines. For many Victorians, faith became personal, even private, not something assumed, but something wrestled with. Some turned to mysticism, others to spiritualism, seances, or Eastern philosophy. Churches remained full, but so did lecture halls and libraries. And literature reflected this tension. In novels, characters questioned God. In poems, they doubted purpose. Victorian writers gave voice to a generation caught between certainty and doubt, between belief and disillusionment. Sexuality, secrets, and the underworld. One of the most tightly controlled and deeply hypocritical parts of Victorian society was its relationship to sex. Publicly, it was a world of modesty, chastity, and repression. Men and women were expected to follow strict codes of behavior. Morality was policed by gossip, the press, and the law. But privately, behind velvet curtains and gaslit rooms, the picture was different. Victorian cities had sprawling networks of brothels, affairs, and double lives. Homosexuality was not just taboo, it was criminal. In 1895, playwright Oscar Wilde was imprisoned for gross indecency after his affair with another man became public. His trial shocked society, but it also revealed what everyone already knew. Beneath the surface of Victorian virtue was an underworld of desire, repression, and contradiction. In art and literature, the late 19th century began to explore this more honestly. Characters were no longer just good or bad. They were complex, flawed, and often haunted by inner conflict. The end of isolation and the looming storm. Perhaps the most crucial shift as the Victorian age ended was that Britain could no longer pretend to stand alone. Germany was rising. So was the United States. Russia was flexing. Japan was industrializing. And across Europe, alliances were forming, some in secret, some in public. The empire, once secure, was now surrounded by competition. Trade, diplomacy, military power, all became games of strategy and survival. At home, the press began to hint at the unthinkable. That war, real large-scale industrial war, might be coming. And this was a world now equipped with machine guns, railroads, explosives, and telegraphs. If war came, it wouldn't be like the past. It would be something the Victorians had helped invent, but never truly imagined. The 20th century was already stirring. By 1901, when Queen Victoria died, the world was no longer held together by faith in slow progress or imperial stability. It was a world of tensions, old versus new, freedom versus control, science versus spirituality. And the next chapter would not unfold gently. Only 13 years after Victoria's death, the world plunged into the First World War, a conflict of such industrial horror that it shattered all illusions of Victorian order and morality. It was a war made possible by Victorian innovations, machine guns, tanks, long-range artillery, and the telegraph. The same railways that had once carried passengers to holiday towns now transported millions of men to trenches in France. The ideals of glory and empire collapsed in mud and blood. And in many ways, it marked the true end of the Victorian world. A legacy that refused to die. But despite its collapse, the legacy of the Victorian era did not vanish. Much of our modern world is built on its foundation. Our cities, with their grids, pipes, and public transit systems, are largely Victorian in origin. Our schools, our court systems, and even our social services were shaped during this era. The 9-to-5 workweek, the concept of childhood education, public libraries, and even modern police forces, all trace back to Victorian reforms. The dominance of the English language, not just in literature and diplomacy, but also in science and business, was cemented during Britain's global imperial rule. And culturally, our ideas about family, gender roles, success, respectability, and progress are still haunted or inspired by Victorian values. But the contradictions remain, too. The Victorians preached morality, yet maintained vast, violent colonies. They celebrated progress, but suppressed the poor. They idolized women as angels, while denying them rights. They built modern machines and buried their workers inside them. It was, in every sense, an age of duality, the rise of the post-Victorian mindset. In the decades after Victoria's death, a new generation emerged, one that rejected her legacy outright. Writers like Virginia Woolf, George Orwell, and D.H. Lawrence attacked Victorian repression and hypocrisy. Artists embraced abstraction, fragmentation, and psychological realism. The stiff, ordered world of the Victorians seemed naive, or worse, dangerous. In politics, the push for democracy grew stronger. In the UK, women finally gained the right to vote in 1918 partially and 1928 fully. Labor movements gained momentum. And across the empire, subject peoples began to rise, demand freedom, and eventually independence. By the mid-20th century, the empire Victoria had once ruled was dissolving. India gained independence in 1947. Africa would follow in waves. And Britain, once the engine of the world, became just one nation among many. And yet, the Victorian echo remains. Victorian echoes in the 21st century. Even today, in the 21st century, you live in the shadow of the Victorian age. When you step onto a train, when you walk through a city center, when you speak English, follow a daily schedule, or scroll through ideas of morality, family, success, you are walking through Victorian footprints. Your world, fast, crowded, media-saturated, morally complex, and technologically restless, was invented, tested, and twisted during the long 19th century. Even the tensions we wrestle with privacy versus exposure, wealth versus inequality, empire versus freedom, progress versus collapse, these aren't new. The Victorians lived them first. They were not just quaint people in top hats and corsets. They were us, just dressed differently, speaking more formally, and trying to tame a world that was already spinning out of control. What the Victorian era really gave us. So, what did the Victorian era give us? It gave us railways and revolutions, but also repression. It gave us science and sewage systems, but also slums. It gave us the British Museum and the looted artifacts inside it. It gave us the illusion of control, and then exposed how fragile that illusion really is. It gave us a story we're still living, because ultimately, the Victorian era wasn't just about Britain or an aging queen. It was about the birth of the modern world, and everything that came with it: wonder, contradiction, empire, invention, and the deep, endless question of what it means to be civilized. OUTRO. If you've made it this far, you now understand something most people never stop to consider. The Victorian era never truly ended. It evolved. into modern cities, modern identities, modern anxieties. It's in your work routines, your politics, your entertainment, your values. So the next time you pass by a red brick building, open a book printed in English, or hear the ticking of a clock, remember, you are not just a product of the present. You are living in the long shadow of a queen who wore black, a country that ruled the seas, and an age that tried and failed to make the world neat, moral, and permanent. This was the Victorian era, not just a chapter in history, but the blueprint of the world you live in today. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into history.